Chapter 1. Something is wrong. In 1979, something strange started happening across America. Silver was vanishing. Jewelers couldn't keep their shelves stocked. Photographers were paying double for film. Factories that needed silver for electronics couldn't get enough of it, and ordinary people everywhere were rummaging through attics, selling old spoons, old rings, old cutlery, anything silver. Nobody could figure out who was behind it, but someone out there was buying silver at a scale the world had never seen before. When the world finally found out who was doing it, it wasn't a government, it wasn't a bank, it was two brothers from Texas. And they weren't done yet. Chapter 2. The Father's Shadow. To understand what the Hunt brothers were about to do, you have to start with their father. Haroldson Lafayette Hunt, everyone called him HL, was born with almost nothing. In 1930, he struck oil in East Texas. It turned out to be the largest oil deposit anyone had ever found in America. He never stopped. By the end of his life, he was one of the richest men who had ever lived in this country. But for all that wealth, H.L. Hunt did not trust the system that made him rich. Not banks, not government, and not paper money. He believed that one day, the dollar would collapse, that it was built on a promise no one could ever keep. So he did something unusual for one of the richest men in America. He buried silver coins around his property. Not in a vault, in the ground. Real money, he told his children. Something no government can print. Something no inflation can eat away. When H.L. Hunt died in 1974, he left his sons two things: a fortune of $5 billion, and a belief they had carried since childhood, that paper money was a slow trap, and silver was the only real way out. Nelson Bunker Hunt was the eldest son. Loud, self-taught, a natural gambler who trusted his gut over any expert. He raced horses, he made enormous bets, and he never apologized for either. You could hear him coming from down the hall. His brother Herbert was the opposite, quieter, careful. The one who read every document before he signed it. Where Bunker filled a room, Herbert studied it. But on this one thing, the belief their father had given them, they were completely the same. They had $5 billion, and their father's voice still in their heads, telling them exactly what to do with it. Chapter 3. The Thesis. But the Hunt brothers were patient. They waited, and in August 1971, something happened that gave them the signal they had been looking for. On a Sunday night, the President of the United States went on television and told the world something that had never been said before. The dollar would no longer be backed by gold. Before that night, there was a rule. Every dollar in the world had to be backed by a fixed amount of gold sitting in a vault. That rule kept governments from printing money without limit. Nixon ended that rule. From that night forward, governments could print as much money as they wanted. And when you print more money, each dollar you already have becomes worth a little less. For most Americans watching that night, it was just news. For the Hunt brothers, it was proof. Proof that their father had been right about everything. Silver was the answer. You cannot print silver. There is only so much of it in the world. And as paper money slowly lost its value, silver would only become worth more. The brothers were certain of it. They knew what they had to do. They were going to buy silver, as much as they could find, for as long as it took. And they were not going to stop. Chapter 4. The Accumulation. They started carefully, using different companies and different account names, so that nobody could see the pattern. Back then, silver cost less than $2 an ounce. But what made the Hunt brothers different from any ordinary investor was what they did when their purchases came due. They did not hold a contract on paper. They demanded the actual physical silver. Every time a futures contract came due, a promise to buy silver at a future date, they paid in full and collected every bar in person. They were pulling silver out of the market entirely, permanently. Warehouses across Texas filled up with silver bars. When Texas ran out of room, they chartered private planes and flew the silver to vaults in Switzerland. The amount they were building was almost impossible to picture. Hundreds of millions of ounces of physical silver, locked away, taken off the market, never to return. And through all of it, nobody connected the dots. The purchases were spread across so many accounts and companies that the market could not see who was behind it. The price began to climb, slowly at first. By 1979, silver had already tripled in price from where it started. Not because the world suddenly needed more silver. Because the Hunts had quietly removed so much of it from the market that there simply was not enough left. 7 years of patient buying. 7 years of moving in the shadows, and they were only getting started. Chapter 5. The Partners. To do what they really wanted to do, they needed more money. Billions more. Even with $5 billion in the family, the scale they were imagining was beyond what any single family could provide. The answer came from Saudi Arabia after 1973, when Arab nations dramatically raised oil prices. Enormous wealth had poured into the hands of Saudi families, money looking for a home. The Saudis had their own reasons to distrust the dollar. Their oil was sold in American currency. If the dollar lost value, their wealth lost value too. They understood the Hunt brothers' argument immediately. Together, they formed a private group, a secret consortium. Within months, they had added over 150 million ounces of silver to what the Hunts already held. The operation had gone global. When you counted it all up, the Hunts, the Saudi money, the offshore accounts, the physical vaults across 2 continents, they controlled roughly 1/3 of every ounce of silver available for purchase anywhere on Earth. Not silver underground in mines, not silver locked inside machines already being used. The silver that anyone in the world could actually go out and buy, 1/3 of it. Theirs. From Texas, to New York, to Switzerland, to Saudi Arabia, a web of wealth that now quietly controlled the world's silver market from the shadows. And publicly, still, nobody fully understood what had happened. The price of silver was rising in ways that made no sense to anyone on the outside, but the Hunts knew exactly why. Chapter 6. The Corner. Through the second half of 1979, the price of silver started climbing faster, $10 an ounce, then 15, then 20. The speed was unlike anything the commodity markets had seen before. The effects reached into everyday life. Photographers could not afford silver film. Hospitals were rationing silver for medical instruments. Silverware factories were cutting production. The same metal that had quietly disappeared from warehouses years ago was now being felt everywhere. Across America, ordinary people started digging through attics and kitchen drawers. Old cutlery, old rings, old coins. If it was silver, it was suddenly worth serious money. Street corner dealers were buying anything they could find. It became so extreme that Tiffany and Company, one of the most famous jewelers in the world, paid for a full page in the New York Times, publicly condemning the brothers by name, calling what they were doing unconscionable. By January of 1980, the price of silver had gone from $6 an ounce to nearly $50 in 12 months. The Brothers' silver was worth close to $10 billion on paper. $10 billion for a plan that had started with offshore accounts and warehouses in Texas. They had done it, or so it seemed. The most audacious commodity bet in history, and they were winning. But the people who ran the market had been watching everything. And they were not going to let this stand. Chapter 7. The Rule Change. The Silver Exchange had been watching the price climb for months. They knew what was happening. And in January of 1980, they decided to stop it. They introduced a new rule. It made it much harder to borrow money to buy silver. And without the ability to borrow, the Hunts could not keep buying. The buying stopped. The price of silver, which had been climbing for 7 years, began to wobble, and then it started to fall. Then came a second blow. Traders could now only sell their positions, not open new ones. The flow of money that had been pushing prices up was cut off at the source. This is where it turned. The Hunts had borrowed billions to buy silver. That debt did not change just because the price was falling. And as silver dropped, the banks started asking for their money back. Margin calls. When the value of what you have bought falls below a certain level, your lender demands you pay the difference in cash. Right away. No extensions. No negotiations. The Hunts were receiving margin calls they could barely keep up with. They had silver, enormous amounts of it. But silver that was losing value every day, and the cash they needed was running out. Every day, the price fell a little more. Every day the margin calls got harder to meet. The window was closing, and it would close on a Thursday morning in March. Chapter 8. Silver Thursday. By March of 1980, silver was sitting at around $21 an ounce, down from nearly $50 just weeks before. The Hunts had been scrambling to meet margin calls for weeks, but they were running out of room. On the morning of March the 27th, a Thursday, the largest single margin call arrived. $135 million, due that same day. They could not pay, and when the market opened, when the news of the default began to spread, silver did not just fall, it collapsed. From $21 an ounce to $10.80 in a single trading day. The biggest single-day drop in the history of the silver market. A day that would forever be known as Silver Thursday. Brokers who had lent money to silver buyers across America were suddenly facing enormous losses. Banks that had financed the Hunts were staring at hundreds of millions in unpaid debt. The panic rippled outward, from silver into bonds, into stocks, into the wider American economy. The trading floors went into a kind of chaos the markets had not seen before. Not the chaos of a boom, the chaos of a collapse. The damage was so large that a group of America's biggest banks had to step in. They put together an emergency loan of over $1 billion. Not to save the Hunt brothers, to prevent the collapse from spreading, to keep the banks that had lent against silver from failing themselves. The system protected itself first. Nelson Bunker Hunt and his brother were summoned before the United States Congress to explain themselves. They sat before a committee of senators, under oath, and answered questions about the most audacious commodity play the world had ever seen. In 1988, 8 years after Silver Thursday, a jury found them guilty of conspiring to manipulate the silver market. They were ordered to pay over $130 million in damages. They were banned from trading in American commodity markets for life. Nelson Bunker Hunt filed for personal bankruptcy in 1988. Debts of $2.5 billion When asked how it felt to lose a fortune, he shrugged and said, "$1 billion is not what it used to be." Chapter 9. The Lesson. So what actually happened here? Two brothers tried to corner a market. They very nearly succeeded. Then the rules changed, and everything collapsed. That is the surface of the story. The deeper lesson is this: the rules of any market, any game, any system, are written and controlled by whoever benefits most from the existing order. And when someone wins too big, those people change the rules. The Hunt brothers did not lose because silver was a bad investment. Silver actually did go up. They were right about that. They lost because they forgot that the exchange controlling the market could simply rewrite the rules at any point, and did. You see this pattern everywhere once you know to look for it. A small company disrupts an industry until the established players lobby to have it regulated out of existence. An employee negotiates too hard and finds themselves quietly managed out. The system always protects itself. So before you make any big move, in business, in investment, in your career, the question is not just, am I right? It is, who controls the rules of this game, and what will they do when my position gets large enough to threaten them? The Hunt brothers were right about silver. They were wrong about the rules, and that was the only mistake that mattered. This is Leverage, where we break down the hidden stories behind money, power, and the systems that quietly run the world. If topics like this interest you, consider subscribing so you never miss a single video. And if you enjoyed it, like, share, and comment down below your favorite part. Thank you for watching.